Hello, everyone, and welcome to another video in my series on legal practice. Today, I'm speaking with Joshua Prentice, who is a senior counsel at Jacobs. Josh and I went to the same law school, so we have a shared background. Welcome, Josh. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So, Josh, before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about your background before you
Sure.
tell us about what you're specifically doing for Jacobs. So if you wouldn't mind, tell us where you attended undergrad, where you attended law school, and kind of give us a little timeline as to how you got to where you are right now.
Sure. So I graduated from Rutgers University. I was a history and political science double major. I graduated in 2004. I didn't start law school until 2009. So in between undergrad and law school, I was in the Army for just under 5 years. I did ROTC, was on a scholarship, had multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, and had sort of always wanted to go to law school for various reasons that I think are probably pretty common among folks. And then I went to GW, like Adam said, with him in 2009 and graduated in 2012. And then I worked for two large firms. One was a large regional / national law firm based in Ohio after I graduated. And then I moved on from there after about 2 years to a large global firm, Denton's, in their Denver office. And after being there for a couple of years, we can get more into the details of this, but I kind of realized I didn't want to be in a large law firm forever and would rather work in-house at a company, whether it was large, small, or medium-sized. And I made that transition to CH2M Engineering, which is now part of Jacobs, my current company.
Okay, cool. Well, one thing that I did pick out of your timeline that maybe is worth bringing up for the students is, you had military background. Why not the JAG Corps? Why did you choose ultimately to go into private practice instead of sticking with the military? Were there any particular reasons?
It was probably always an option. I think that if I was going to have, joined the JAG Corps, I probably would have done the funded legal education program, which the Army offered. But at the time, due to various personal reasons, I didn't really want to stay in the Army or stay committed to the Army when I got out and started law school. So I made a clean break and just ended my service and went to law school. During my first and second year, I did, explore the option of maybe joining the Navy JAG Corps, just because I thought the Navy JAG Corps did some more interesting types of law than the Army, though a lot of the overlap, a lot of the work is very, very similar and there's significant overlap. But in the end, I just decided, I'm just going to try something different and new. And, sometimes I look back and maybe I should have done the JAG Corps. I don't know, but I guess you'll always have those questions about your career trajectory, no matter what it is.
Sure. So let's talk about your time in big law. So you were working for bigger firms, and you did work for a regional firm, but then you also worked for Denton.
Yep.
You saw kind of two levels of big law.
Sure.
Describe your experience there. Why did you ultimately decide to go in-house? What were some things you learned from the big law experience? Any insights you can give us would be great.
So my first firm was Taft, Stettinius and Hollister, which was at the time a firm of about 500 lawyers or so spread across the Midwest. So arguably it was a national law firm. It was certainly big law in any sort of ranking. I lucked out there because I was in a relatively small practice group. So I worked for two partners, and there's only two other associates in the niche field that I was in, which was government contracts. And so I kind of benefited a lot, as compared to some other people who started in much larger firms, and that I had very substantive experience early on. And I wasn't just doing kind of scut or grunt work, if you will, early on in my career. And there's a lot of hands-on work that I did. And, my transition to Denton's, which was previously McKenna, Long and Aldridge, obviously there's a lot of mergers and acquisitions in the law firm world. But that really happened because I got a call one night from a recruiter who said there's an opening in the Denver office at this firm. And, McKenna, Long and Aldridge at the time, when I joined them, was sort of like the New York Yankees of government contracts. It was, you're a government contracts lawyer and they call, you're going to want to work for them. And I knew that whether or not I stayed in a large law firm or moved to something else, whether it was government or in-house or even just to the business world, I knew that that was going to be a better platform to make that move from. And it was a very easy decision to apply to that firm. Moving up to McKenna and then Denton's, McKenna was probably 900 to 1,000 lawyers, I want to guess, across the United States. And when I joined them, they merged with Denton's about 3 months later. So, to me, it was, I got one set of business cards and then 3 months later that changed. But Denton's, is still and was at the time the largest law firm in the world. At the time, it was about 3,000 lawyers. I think it's over 4,000 now. And that's a true global firm. It's in the United States, South America, across Asia Pacific, and then Europe, the Middle East, and even Africa. They have some offices. So that was a transition, although I was still somewhat insulated from it, because just like I was when I was at Taft, I was in a smaller office. So the Taft office that I was located in, I was in a practice group of about 4 lawyers, like I said, and in an office of 20 to 25. And when I moved to Denver for McKenna and Dentons, it was an office about 20 to 25. It just happened to be in a law firm of 3,000 lawyers around the world. And so I was still somewhat insulated from that change. But I think that I started to realize that I didn't want to stay in a large law firm or even maybe a small law firm. After I was probably about 4 years in, the large law firm or big law kind of trajectory. And I realized that I liked working with my clients, and I liked solving problems for them. And I liked figuring out solutions to complex issues, whether they were legal or regulatory or just business, right? I just didn't always like being the emergency phone call every single time. And I liked working with them at the outset of an issue. I liked being involved in the technical approach to, an issue. And I realized that the only true way to do that, I thought, was to move in-house. Now, there are some lawyers in big law that can do that, but they're very few and far between. And those are sort of in the pyramid of lawyers. They're at the very top of the pyramid. And they are, partners who have decades of experience who are called upon to work through issues. And that just wasn't going to be my trajectory probably for decades. And I didn't want to wait for that. And so I started exploring options, and my kind of the way I made a list was I said, okay, here's the companies that I might want to work for. And here's the companies based on my experience that I would absolutely not want to work for. And that was sort of an arbitrary bifurcation, because the companies I didn't want to work for sometimes was because I had a bad experience with a lawyer at that company. That might be a silly reason not to work for that company, but it just put me off in some way. There are, in the government contracts world, SpaceX, for example, has a reputation for being a very litigious company, for suing people at the drop of a hat. And I didn't want to be a part of that. And it's not to say they're a bad company and any of you or other lawyers would not enjoy working for them. I just didn't want to do it. And so I made those lists and I looked for openings. I had a lot of interviews, simply probably because of my background, going to a good law school and in government contracts. Government contracts as a field, and I know you haven't talked a lot about practice group areas, but it tends to be a little bit more low density, if you will, for lawyers. And so there's fewer of us to go around. I also, at the time, and still do, maintain a security clearance. So that was an added benefit for me in applying places. And so I applied, I had a bunch of interviews, and I ended up settling, so to speak, but it's where I wanted to work on CH2M Engineering, which was actually a firm client at the time, even though I didn't work on their matters. And they were headquartered in Denver. It was a very easy transition. I didn't have to move anywhere. Like if I was going to work for Lockheed, I would have had to move to Dallas or something like that. And so it was a pretty easy transition. And again, it was a pretty lean office, not that many lawyers per dollars in revenue. And in the in-house world, that's often how you judge how big an office is or a headquarters is for lawyers, is how many lawyers per dollars and hundreds of millions in revenue, et cetera. And they were at about 1 lawyer per 400 million in revenue versus some of our competitors who were 1 lawyer per 200 million in revenue. So it was a lot leaner. And again, I had really great experience and I loved working for my boss, and he seemed like a good guy when I interviewed with him. And so that was a kind of an easy call. Yeah. And after I started working for them, I did that for a couple of years. And then I moved to another project, which we can talk about if you want, to kind of get where I am today.
Yeah. Let me ask you really fast before we talk specifically about what in-house counsels actually do.
Sure.
That's the path that you just charted is kind of what I conceive of as the traditional path to being in-house, that you spend some time in private practice, whether it be litigation or M&A work. You're working for a firm, and then a few years in, you transition in-house. Is that true? Is that typically the path? Do you have to go that path? Why is that typically the traditional path?
I think it is the typical path. Absolutely. For most people who move in-house, it depends on the company, certainly. It depends on what your background is or what your relationship sometimes is with that company. But I think the timeline that I just told you, which was my timeline, was a little bit accelerated compared to what some people do. I think a lot of people, it's 7 to 10 years in law firms, then they move in-house. I know that CH2M made an exception to hire me. And they based that off of my military experience and saying that I was more mature because I had more professional experience before law school, et cetera. Mainly, they just wanted to hire me and had to find a reason to, to justify their policy being changed. But I do think that's a typical timeline as far as you work in a large law firm or small law firm, and then you move to a company, and then maybe move to a different company and do that. I think the hardest part of that trajectory is the switch from the firm to the company, right? There's often a perception that is really a misperception that in-house counsel work less than big law. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. But moving to in-house, sometimes they're very protective of those jobs because they don't want someone who is just trying to get a break from big law.
Yeah.
And sometimes there are people who do get a break from big law, but they also take a pay cut, and then they're very unhappy because they took a bigger pay cut than they wanted. So it's really sifting through trying to find the people that are the right match for the company, because in-house is very different than big law in some ways. And I think one way that it's very different is that you have to be much better with people than sometimes you have to be in big law. I'm sure you've interviewed a bunch of big law lawyers and talked to them, but I think in big law sometimes you have lawyers that are very good technically, they're very proficient at the law, but they are not good managers. They are not good at the soft skills that are required in a management or business role. And an in-house lawyer, and we could talk more about it, but a lot of what I do is not hard legal skills. It is soft skills of just dealing with people and being in a large organization and working issues through, rather than just hard legal skills of writing a memorandum and doing legal research.
Well, let's talk about that actually. So what distinguishes an in-house counsel from, say, an outside counsel? When I was at the firm, I was outside counsel to other clients. Right. What makes you different from hiring someone that's working for a firm? How does your relationship with the company and your client change?
Right. So I think the major difference is that an in-house counsel only has one client. It's the company that I work for. Right. An outside counsel has a whole plethora of clients often, or sometimes they only work for one, but it's, based on the partner they work for. But I only have one client, and that's Jacobs. And Jacobs is a large global engineering and professional services and technology company. A lot of our work is for national and state and local governments around the world, but also some commercial and private entities as well. And we're about $13 billion in revenue. So what makes us different is that, when a salesperson wants to enter into a contract or has a question, they call me, and it's a line of business that I work with all the time. So I know them. I work with them every day, sometimes multiple times a day, right? When they have issues or questions. And a lot of it is, make sure they're following policy, and just, I know the business better than I think any outside counsel could ever know the business. And so I'm able to make judgment calls for the business as a leader, generally, from a risk and a legal perspective, that an outside counsel would spend a lot of money to research and then really just say, hey, this is your decision, right? Because I can only, usually outside counsel will, 90% of what they do is probably advising on the law, right? They're going to give you your, limitations purely from a legal perspective. Maybe if they know your business really well, a little bit from a risk and strategy perspective, but then they're going to tell you, what do you want to do? Or you're going to tell them what you want to do, and they're going to tell you yes or no, give you a thumbs up or thumbs down as to whether or not you can do that. And I think that probably the best example of what an in-house counsel does is sort of like when you're learning how to drive, right? You're in the driver's seat, and if you're in the driver's seat, you're the business person, right? You're the senior vice president of a line of business in a large company, and in the passenger seat is your driving instructor, and that's sort of like the in-house lawyer. Now, the in-house lawyer is not driving the car, but they've got the oh crap brake if they get hit if they have to. And as you're driving, all they're doing is they're saying, hey, maybe you should just kind of move around this car. Maybe you should slow down a little bit, or maybe you should speed up and pass them, or hey, go for it, get on that highway. But they're prepared to slam on the brake if they have to. And that's sort of what I do, right? If there's an enterprise decision that I think is going to expose, let's say, the company as a whole to risk, right? It's going to expose us to a class action lawsuit or something, some very high level of risk, in a large project. I have the power to say, no, and to escalate that if I have to. But most of the time it's just saying, let's change this language a little bit here, let's do this here, or here's a different way of approaching this. And I let them go forth and make money for the company, because in the end, we have the same goal, which is having Jacobs or whatever company you're working for be a successful enterprise. And I think as outside counsel, you of course want your clients to be successful, but in the end, you work for a large law firm and your money is coming from them, whereas I am fully vested in my company being successful because that's where my paycheck comes from.
So let me ask you this. Let's say that there's a matter that Jacobs is facing. So maybe it's a litigation. Maybe there's a class action lawsuit that's been filed, or maybe there's an acquisition that Jacobs is trying to obtain. Are you the one appearing in those matters? Are you going to trial and defending? At what point do you reach out to external counsel and bring them on for some of these specific matters? Are you just doing 1,000 things at once? Talk to us a little bit about that.
I would say, yes, I am doing 1,000 things at once, but a lot of them are not going to trial. So I will probably never appear in court for Jacobs unless it's to observe outside counsel at trial. Generally, so give you a little bit of idea about how Jacobs Legal is set up to help explain it maybe a little bit better. We have operations counsel, which is kind of a general term for those who sort of work hand in hand with the business, and that's what I fall under. And then we also have litigation counsel, who are also in-house counsel who work in litigation. We also have some more specialty folks doing corporate and securities work like SEC compliance and all that sort of stuff. But if we have a lawsuit or an issue that comes in, let's say there's a personal injury claim, a very basic, like a trip and fall incident, right? So one of the businesses that I support is a large water and operations and maintenance business. So, on the West Coast, and we have a lot of work in California and also in the Southeast and across the United States, frankly. But part of what we do is we run wastewater plants, we run water treatment facilities. And so, let's say that someone trips and falls on a water meter and they sue our client and they say, well, that was your responsibility, was to maintain that. I will kind of do the initial look at it. I'll probably talk to the plaintiff's counsel, maybe I'll put our insurers on notice. But then when it actually gets to a lawsuit being filed, I will actually talk to our litigation counsel in-house, and then usually we'll hire outside counsel to manage those, simply because we are not resourced to manage all of our litigation matters. I mean, you can imagine, I don't even know how many litigation matters we have, frankly. I probably personally manage a couple dozen at this point, just from April, but almost all of those have outside counsel on them. And so once it's assigned to outside counsel, my job is really to be a liaison between outside counsel and the business. So, and I don't know how much you've talked about the stages of litigation, how that works, but when there's discovery phases and they're asking questions and they have to do depositions and interview employees, I will make sure that's happening and make sure it's happening appropriately and make sure the business is represented appropriately. But if it actually goes to trial or a hearing or something like that, I'm not going to appear and represent the company. We've had large matters where our counsel have flown around the world to sit in the room while very highly paid outside counsel do the real work, but it's because they're there as a representative of the company to make sure things go smoothly and then to report back and make sure that everyone understands what's going on.
So it sounds like it's a lot of managerial work. So it's a lot of kind of managing all these different pieces at once without necessarily diving deeply into one specific thing. You're really kind of at a top level, making sure that the whole machinery is working.
Yeah, I think it depends on the day, right? There are some issues that I will get, waist deep involved in, but then some issues that it's very high level that I kind of parachute in and make some sort of impact and then leave as quickly as possible. And a lot of it is just going to be time management. But sometimes there are issues that certainly require in-depth involvement. There are projects that are, for our line of business and what we're in, very high risk. So design build contracting would be an example for that. So let's say, the city of Los Angeles wants to build a $2 billion wastewater treatment facility, and they're going to hire a company like Jacobs to design that and also build it. And those are major projects. They are capital investments from our company and from the client. And there's a lot of risk involved in that because not only are we designing it, but we're also building it. And sometimes we're also operating it. And so those types of projects, and especially those of hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars, I'm going to be very involved. And I think it's also just depends on your approach as an inside counsel or in-house counsel. How do you approach these problems? Do you have the time to invest in them? Do you want to be involved? I mean, I personally like going to meetings that are technical in nature or engineering in nature And sometimes I'll do other work during those meetings, especially now that we're working from home and it's remote, if I don't think I have to really pay attention. But it's always good to at least sort of be involved a little bit in those, because you can kind of absorb some of that information and maybe interject here and there just to better understand an issue.
Right.
Because it's much harder, like anything, right? It's harder to cram for a test than it is to just study throughout the semester. It's harder to cram for reviewing a 200-page contract than it is to, be involved in the formation of that contract through a multi-month period, because some of these projects are negotiated and bid on over 6 to 12 months. I mean, these are long-term bids, let alone the actual design and construction.
Well, I was going to ask you what your day-to-day would look like, but it sounds like it can be very unpredictable. It sounds like, in a given week, you could be working on one project, but by next week, you could be working on something completely different.
Yeah, I think, there are some, I think my average week is probably 55 to 60 hours, depending on the week. It depends on the day, what hours within the day that falls into. I tend to be somewhat of a morning person. So I
Mhm.
wake up early, I'll often get some work done. Then maybe I'll go to the gym or take a break, make breakfast now that I'm working from home, or, make lunch or whatever it's going to be, and then do more work. But there are a lot of calls, especially now that we're, working from home. But even before that, the businesses that I support within Jacobs are spread all over the country and the world. So, it's hard to pinpoint what time zone people are in sometimes. And so I can have a call at 7 a.m. and also a call at 6 p.m. sometimes. And that's just the way it works.
Yeah.
But my company is very flexible and very respectful of the hours that we put in. And they understand sometimes if I want to block out time from 4 to 5 so I can run to Target or run to get groceries, that no one really checks on you for that
Yeah.
sort of thing. Like sometimes, in big law, right, you may be expected to have FaceTime in the office or something like that. And you've got to be there. That's not really the case for me, but my day to day is probably, I mean, I could pick up my calendar and look, but most of the time during the week, I probably have on average 4 to 5 hours worth of meetings a day. And that's just a swag here, a silly, guess, but it's probably around there. Some days I've had 7 to 8 hours or more of meetings a day. Those are probably on one end of the bell curve, and then the other side, you've got, probably at a minimum 1 to 2, maybe 3 hours a day, and the rest of the time you have time for work to actually get the stuff done you need to get done. And those, I've started sometimes blocking out time during my day, so people can't see my Outlook calendar, what it says on it, but they can tell if I'm busy or not.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I block out an hour or two here or there, and that's pretty common. Because my boss and I sort of have an agreement that if I need him or he needs me, I'll just reach out to him. And people know that too, that sometimes people block out time. So sometimes they'll just try and schedule something. And I'm at the point in my career now, luckily, where I can reject meetings most of the time, unless it's someone who's like 2 levels above me, and then I will never reject it.
Yeah.
But yeah, days are just vary between meetings, on video, not on video. And sometimes those meetings it's easier to have a conversation than it is
Yeah.
to have 50 emails back and forth about something. And I don't mind that at all. And sometimes it's in-depth conversations with people to try and work through an issue.
Yeah.
And so I've had, for example, a lot of meetings recently about an IP, an intellectual property issue, that we're working through because we're trying to develop a new service and a new product. And we're trying to work through who owns certain intellectual property, what we can use, what we can't use, and how we're going to protect that, because we actually don't have intellectual property attorneys. So, we're working with some outside counsel now, but that's an issue that we've been working through and having a lot of meetings simply because we need to understand the lay of the land and understand what the product even is and how it's going to work before we move forward with that dilemma.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, and now I want to shift a little bit more to maybe some advice that you could pass along to
Sure.
students. Let's say you're an undergraduate, you're planning to go to law school, and you have your sights set on being in-house counsel. Maybe you've heard it in the media, or maybe you've watched shows where there's depictions of in-house counsel, or maybe you know family members that do it in some capacity. What are the pros and cons? Why would someone choose this career path over, say, we talked a little bit about big law, but why would you choose this path over, say, the dozens or so other paths that you could choose as a lawyer?
I think you really get to know the business you're working with. So you have to want to work for the business you're working for, certainly, but you really get to know how the business operates. You get to know how their profit and loss happens, right? I mean, I earned my MBA and my company paid for it. right, while I was working. But you really get to know people, you get to know how things function, you get to know the nuts and bolts. And I think that working in house often opens up a lot of opportunities sometimes that you would not have that are very varied. So a good example is my company asked me if I would move to Paducah, Kentucky, after a couple of years at CH2M, then Jacobs, to work for a nuclear deactivation and remediation project that we had that required a full-time lawyer, that was paid for by the government. It was government contract. And they said, hey, would you be willing to go for a couple of years? And I said, yeah, sure, let's go. And I got to be a general counsel and the only lawyer for 1,000 employees and $150 million in revenue. It was a great experience. And I wanted to come back after about 2 years to get out of that kind of smaller town. But that was an opportunity that would not have opened itself up, I think, if I had stayed in big law or worked at a law firm. And another example, is that my company, after being back in Denver for a little while, asked me if I'd be willing to move to the United Kingdom to take on a role for someone that was retiring, as part of our voluntary retirement. So that's, there are a lot of opportunities I think that open up. And once you choose, a role, if you work in a large law firm, you take the typical approach. You work in a large law firm, you move in-house. There's nothing saying you cannot move back to a large law firm. It's not very common, but I do have friends who have done that. I have friends who I worked with at Denton's who moved in-house and have moved back to firms. Often it's not large firms, often it's smaller to medium-sized firms because they just didn't want to go back to big law, but they've moved back because they wanted to kind of take that in-house experience and then help other companies. But they wanted to get, paid in a different environment and work in a firm to do that.
Yeah.
And I think you'll also find there's, in some cases, or many cases, I think probably better work-life balance. You'll probably hear from the big law people about the billable hour. I technically have billable hours, but I just have to bill 80 of them in a 2-week period. So, and anything after 80, I can just take time off if I want, although obviously I still have to get my work done. So I think you'll find some more flexibility in the work-life balance, although it's still a demanding job. People should not have the misconception that if they move in-house, it's going to be, 35 to 40 hours a week every time. And sometimes that happens, right? I mean, before the holidays, it's certainly less busy, or, there are some weeks where I don't have many meetings at all. And that's just the ebb and flow of the communication and the business. But, if you want to make that transition to in-house, it certainly opens up more opportunities, and doesn't really close many off, I would say, if you do that.
What advice would you give to somebody, in their law school experience? Any particular classes that you would recommend that people should take? Obviously, the first year curriculum is
Sure.
designed to pass the bar. You have to take ethics, things like that. But are there any particular things that you, looking back now, feel like I wish I would have taken that class, or I'm glad I took that class?
My philosophy on law school classes tend to be you should take what you want to take at the time. I kind of balanced my second and third year electives with government contracts classes because I knew I wanted to do government contracts, and classes that I just thought were interesting. But looking back on it, I wish I had taken more taxation classes. I took federal income taxation, which a lot of people take the basic class, but I do wish that I had taken international tax and corporate taxation. They sound like really boring classes, but I promise you, 85% plus of corporate strategy and finance decisions are based on tax implications. And it sounds really boring, but that is the reality of it. And I've learned a lot of it on the go and just on my own, but those classes may have been helpful. But I certainly wouldn't say absolutely you have to take those if you want to move in-house. You don't. Would it have been helpful? Probably. I think insurance classes are probably similar. Insurance is a very complicated issue at large global companies like Jacobs and any other, Fortune 500 company. It's a very complicated issue. We have lawyers that all they do is deal with insurance coverage, and it is critical to understanding. 90% plus of my job is understanding risk and making sure that the appropriate risk is taken on by the company, balanced against the revenue and the profit they're going to make. And a lot of that is based on what our insurance coverage is, right? Are you self-insured? Do you have policies that will cover X, Y, and Z? And things like that. And so insurance and tax would probably be the two areas. If I said, if I could go back and take those without, waking up too early or, staying up too late or impacting my life in law school, I'd probably take those. Yeah. But you know what? I took a class that was on the wire in criminal justice, and I really didn't learn anything in that class, but I had a lot of fun, and I still have friends from that class. So I don't regret taking classes that were probably useless either.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's actually end with that very thought here really fast. So, if you could go back and you could advise yourself before you ever even started the law school experience,
Yeah.
or maybe to put this another way, if you had a room full of undergrads in front of you, what advice would you give to people that are planning to go into law school, to go into practice in any form, things that maybe you wish you would have known?
Don't assume that your career will be at the margins, right? But don't assume that you're going to make $200,000 when you get out of law school. But don't assume that you're going to make $40,000 out of law school either. And you shouldn't assume that just because you start somewhere that that's where you're going to end. You know, my salary was much higher when I moved to Denton's than it was when I was at Taft, right? And that was just because I got a call from a recruiter. You know, we don't know what our path is going to be. And so to add on to that, you know, you also shouldn't be afraid of taking chances. You know, a lot of us get into, let's say you get into a very safe role at a law firm or in the government, and you say, you know what, I don't know that this is for me. And you get a call about an opportunity like to go to Kentucky like I did, and I took it, right? That was not a sure thing by any stretch, and it was a great opportunity. And when you're also considering law school and you say, you know, what if I don't like being a lawyer? That's probably a common concern. And there's a lot of lawyers that probably don't like being lawyers. I do. I like being a lawyer.
Mhm.
But you shouldn't assume that becoming a lawyer, that you're going to have to be a lawyer forever. You can always switch to something else, right? Adam is a good example that you can always switch to something else. And much of my role is non-legal, right? I think I like being a lawyer, probably maybe because I am not doing legal research every day and writing memorandums.
Yeah.
And so your legal career will take, you know, it's like a tree, right? There's going to be a lot of branches you can choose, but in the end, you know, you're probably going to be, more likely than not, you're going to be happy with your decision as long as you make an educated choice to go to law school and not just thinking it's going to be the best of the best no matter what, because, you know, there's a small percentage of people that end up in those exceptionally high paying jobs right out of law school, but that doesn't mean you can't be in one of those eventually, right? So
No, that's great. These are all things that I pass along to the students, and it's really important that we remember that our careers when we're in our early 20s are not going to be our careers in our mid
yeah,
30s, mid 40s, late 50s, things like that.
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Joshua Prentice, thank you so much for talking with me
Yeah,
today.
thank you.
And students, if you have questions for Josh, I can always field those. Feel free to email me. I'll pass those along to him. And I'm
Yeah,
sure.
absolutely. I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Josh. I appreciate you talking with me today.
All right. Thank you.